underway here, and want to welcome everyone here. And we still have a good turnout for adult Sunday school. We're down a little bit in numbers in all parts of our church because of the fact that our youth and all the youth leaders are away, and that's a lot of people. But there's still lots of us that remain, so we will carry on. We are obviously continuing with our look at the book of Genesis. Getting pretty close to the halfway point in Genesis. The plan today is that we will be mainly in chapters 22 and 23 today in Genesis. Next week, chapter 24 is actually a very long chapter, and so we'll probably just do one chapter next week, because if you look at how long chapter 24 is, you'll see it's actually longer than most of the other chapters put together. And so that's likely what's going to happen. But today it'll be two chapters, and this will be an interesting discussion because the story about the near sacrifice of Isaac, this is one that gets a lot of discussion among Christians. And how do we make sense of this? And it seems to contradict God's character in the Bible. And does this mean that we sort of set the story aside and all that? So we'll take a look at it. I think it definitely raises some interesting questions. And so last week, we were in the previous two chapters that describe the birth of Isaac, and of course, this is significant. Abraham has been promised by God that he will be a great nation, and that his descendants will be more numerous than the sands and the sand of the seashore and the stars in the sky and all that. That obviously wouldn't happen if Abraham didn't have any descendants. So Isaac is kind of a big deal. And so Isaac has finally come along. He has the son of promise, and that's what makes chapter 22 rather abrupt in terms of what we find here. You'll see what I mean as I read. So, beginning of chapter 22, we'll start with the first few verses. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. So the story starts out with this phrase. It says that God tested Abraham. Now, it's important to note here that there is a difference between testing and tempting. We know from in the New Testament, you read the book of James, where it says that God tempts no one, nor does he draw anyone into temptation. So God does not draw us into sin. He does not tempt us to sin. But God does test us. And the difference between testing and tempting is where you're essentially put with a situation, a scenario, and it's an opportunity to reveal whether your faith is real or whether it's fake. And so testing is where you are put into a tough situation, and now we see whether your faith is real or not. And God decides to test Abraham. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about this question of, well, it'll actually come up very shortly, why? Why would God do this? I mean, why ask him to do this sacrifice of his son, a human? That's human sacrifice. And also, if God knows everything, why does he have to test anyone? Wouldn't God already know what's in Abraham's heart? Why go through this whole process? These are some of the things we're going to talk about. I want to start out here by pointing out this is something you miss if you don't know Hebrew. I don't know Hebrew, but fortunately I read commentaries of people who do know Hebrew, and so they help me sort of not miss as many of these things as I otherwise would. The phrase here where God is having Abraham go, you'll notice in verse 2, where it says, he said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. So one thing that does come through clearly in the English is that there's no wiggle room for Abraham. So if Abraham thought that he could get off on a technicality, so for example, if it was take your son and go offer him as a sacrifice, Abraham might be tempted to sort of say, hey, I wonder what Ishmael's up to. Maybe I could offer him. Maybe I can offer one of my servants in his place. Like there's got to be other options here. But nope, it's your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. So God names him, and it's the son whom you love. There's no doubt that it's Isaac that we're talking about. So after clearly identifying who is to be taken, you see this phrase where it says, and go to the land of Moriah. Now here's where knowledge of Hebrew comes in handy. The word that's translated go here is the exact same phrase in Hebrew as you find in Genesis chapter 12 when God says to Abram, go from your country. The Hebrew, the transliteration of that is lek leka. And the commentaries point out that there's more to this than just simply the statement to go. It's actually go, and there's like a promise with it. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, when I finished up the course I was teaching at Steinbeck Bible College, as part of the course, I actually had a Jewish rabbi come in to talk to my class because we were talking about Zionism. And this was Rabbi Annabelle Mass, who's from the Sherei Zedek Synagogue in Winnipeg. And he actually spent some time describing, quoting from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, and he explained that this Hebrew phrase, lek leka, and again, he actually said it in the Hebrew, it has the implied meaning of go for your benefit. So it's not just hey, you should go. It's when Abram was called, go from your country, God was calling him to go, and it's going to be for your benefit, which makes it all the more, striking when you see the same lek leka phrase here in verse 2. Go, that same implied like for your benefit. It's that same calling. So just as God had asked Abraham to trust him when he was called to go to the land of Canaan, God is now asking Abraham to go and to follow him in the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay, so what do we do with this? Because let's be honest here, this is, if any parent now decided to offer their child as a sacrifice and they said God called them to do that, we would call the police and they'd be put in jail. Like they'd be arrested, they'd go on trial, and they'd use their defense. And if they're lucky, they might be found, not guilty by reason of insanity and such. But there's no circumstance now where we're just going to go, okay, yeah, I guess God was calling him, no problem. So clearly we would have a problem with doing this today. So how do we deal with this? Let me tell you about one perspective that's actually becoming popular in certain Christian circles. I don't hold this perspective myself, so I'll just put that caveat in there, but you should at least be exposed to it because it's a common one in certain circles, and we need to at least give it some consideration. For those of you, some of you may have heard of Dr. Greg Boyd. He's a well-known pastor in Minnesota, also a New Testament scholar. He's written a lot of books, written a lot of good stuff. Probably his most famous book lately is titled Cross Vision. And in his book, he puts forth what he calls the cruciform hermeneutic. And Boyd essentially, and this is where he's actually quite Anabaptist in his thinking. This is where, in a lot of Anabaptist circles, his thinking has some resonance, because Boyd says, look, we have to interpret everything through the lens of Jesus. And so if something in any other part of the Bible doesn't fit with what we see in the teachings of Jesus, in the red letters in the Bible, then we need to reinterpret that through the cruciform hermeneutic, as he puts it. And so here's what Boyd argues. Boyd argues that Abraham had actually adopted the belief in child sacrifice from his surrounding culture. that because child sacrifice was common in the ancient Near East, Abraham had accepted this belief. And so Abraham actually came to believe that God wanted him to do this. And so the way that Boyd and those who would agree with him read this is that God actually was not calling Abraham to sacrifice his son. Abraham interpreted God's call in this way. God saved him at the last minute from going through with it. And so that's how Greg Boyd and scholars who would sort of be in his line of thought think about this. Can you hold that view and believe in the Bible? Yes, you can. It requires some interesting reinterpretations. Now, I don't hold that view myself. The reason I don't hold the view myself is I just don't think it fits the text. I mean, the author here, or editor, and again, I would say that it's Moses, has written it in such a way that God is speaking. And I don't see how I can read this and read anything other than God is giving a command to Abraham, and Abraham is going through with it. And Abraham, as we see later, is quite reluctant on this. I find it difficult to go along with that interpretation. But some of you might even hold that view. I mean, Greg Boyd is very popular. He writes well, and there's others who would agree with him. If you hold that view, that's fine. That's not the view that I'm going to be using as I go through. But I wanted to just acknowledge that there's more than one perspective on this. Anyway, as we see in verse 3, Abraham, it says that he rises early in the morning. You know what that tells us? He's on the move. There's no delay in following God's command. And so Abraham rises early in the morning, and he takes Isaac. And now it would have been an interesting journey. And it says on verse 4, on the third day that Abraham, tells the young man to stay, and it's just he and the boy, just he and Isaac that are going to proceed to the next spot. And then Isaac is carrying the wood for the burnt offering, and Abraham's got the knife and such. And then verse 7, Isaac asks a very logical question. Where is the we're ready for the fire, we've got the wood, where's the lamb for burnt offering? That is an excellent question, because that's an obvious thing that would have been missing. And in the English, however, we actually miss something here again. And here I'm actually going to quote from one of my commentaries that explains this further, because rather than just try to put it in my own words, I'm just going to quote. So I'll read from the exact pages here. But if you look in the English answer here, verse 8, Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Now, if you look at just the English, it looks like it's a very simple answer. Abraham is just saying that, God will figure it out. God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. But there's actually more to what Abraham said. So this is one of the many commentaries I use. This is a new one, the Seventh-day Adventist International Bible Commentary. An Old Testament scholar writes the following, and I'm just going to quote how he explains the Hebrew here. It's quite interesting. The construction of the phrase and of the expressions is particularly telling. First, the word God is put in the beginning of the sentence before the verbal form. This goes counter to the Hebrew regulation, which normally places the verb before its subject. The intention of this irregularity is to emphasize God, to indicate that the solution is only in God. It is God who will see. And the expression "see in connection to himself," because that's actually the literal translation of this, is awkward. It's unique in the Hebrew scriptures. It has the same form as the phrase "lek leka," go in connection to yourself, or go to yourself, or in a reflexive sense, go yourself. As with lek leka, the subject of the verb and the object of the preposition are the same. The verbal form eurilo, generally translated "he will provide," should therefore instead be translated "he will see in connection to himself," "he will see himself," or "he will provide for himself." The parallel with lek leka, which is the go calling, suggests that eurelo should be understood in a similar manner. In that case, the phrase could mean that Abraham was called to go to the land in order to fulfill himself. He foresees that God will see the lamb in order to fulfill himself. The phrase could be translated as follows: God will see for himself as the lamb, which means that God will provide himself as the lamb. The lamb is not preceded by the term et, the Hebrew word that normally introduces the definite object, not translated in English. The word lamb is not to be understood as the object of the verb see. The word lamb is an apposition to the phrase he will see himself, meaning he will see himself as the lamb. The lamb is here identified as God. Thus, the lamb that is referred to here is not merely the physical animal that Isaac had in mind, it is God himself. Now, that's technical, but that just, again, it just sort of shows you how much depth there is in these verses. And so this is not just a simple kind of question about where's the lamb, and Abraham says God will figure it out. There's actually a deeper messianic significance here in that God will see in connection to himself, the lamb, that it's not just God's going to provide a physical animal. There's a hint of God is going to be the lamb, and that, of course, is what Jesus ultimately is. So throughout the Old Testament, it's building the whole way through for Jesus, the Messiah. Important to note, by the way, that there's no indication that Isaac is resisting at any point. Pretty sure Isaac has figured it out by this point. I think he's intelligent enough to sort of realize that, okay, there's only two of you, there's no lamb, we're offering a sacrifice. Abraham's probably not sacrificing himself, so process of elimination, it's pretty clear that that Isaac is the sacrifice. This makes it a test of his faith as well, because Isaac is almost certainly would have easily been able to overpower Abraham and run away and leave. But you see that he does not do that. Okay, that's a lot of stuff there. I will pause there for a moment and open up to any comments and questions. Yes? Yeah.
It says in verse 5, verse 5, he says to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and we will come back to you.
Yep.
So Abraham had faith
Yep.
that the two of them are going and
Yep.
the two of them are going to return.
Yep. And in just a little bit, when we go to the next section, we have a parallel passage where we actually get insight in terms of what's in Abraham's head. Because yes, you're exactly right. He was expecting it was going to be the two of them coming back. But he was also expecting to do the sacrifice. He's expecting both. Yep. Isaac would have been, let me think here. We do know an approximate age. I'm trying to remember how it was calculated, but certainly he would have been in young adult age, roughly. So he's not 5, but he's also not 50. So, but sort of, and I'm probably missing something here, but yes, he was definitely not like a young little boy at this point. Sam. Yep. Yes, and I had not written it down, but because I brought my commentary with me, or at least one of them, this is the most detailed one that I have. What was the verse that the Moriah is referenced in again? Verse 2. Okay, so then I'm just going to cheat, and I'm just going to go to my commentary here, because I don't remember off the top of my head, and I know that it did actually have a significance here. Okay, yeah, there it is. We may hear in the word Moriah a play on words. That resonates with Haharim, the mountains, as well as with any forthcoming keyword, Raha, sea. The name is loaded with special significance. It's not an accident that the only places where the name occurs are here and in the story reporting the building of the temple by Solomon. That's the 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. The linguistic links between the two passages confirm this connection. Just skipping ahead to here, it says, on the basis of this association with the name Moriah, Jewish tradition has placed the sacrifice of Isaac on the Temple Mount. Where is that right now? That's where the Muslim Dome of the Rock is in Jerusalem. So there you go. That's so I should just bring this with me every time. Trevor?
Grammar question back to
Right.
verse 2. It says, take your son, your only son Isaac. Now it's an emphasis on the only. Now is that to say that Ishmael is no longer in existence, or is it that he doesn't love Ishmael?
No, Ishmael is definitely in existence because later when Abraham dies, Ishmael helps bury him. He actually reunites with Isaac. It's in the sense of it's his only son of promise. Like he's the only in the chosen line. So in that sense, and also would have been the only son with Abraham at the time because Ishmael had been sent away. So in both senses. Yes. Yeah, how do I picture Isaac in this whole situation? I picture him being genuinely confused, but trusting as well. But I picture him being like, I don't get this. This does not make any sense. But if my dad says that God said we're to do this, then I trust, which again is a sign of faith. But it's good we're thinking this way in terms of because we can't minimize how difficult this story is. This is a big deal. There's a reason why scholars like Greg Boyd are looking for ways to sort of say, actually, maybe God didn't command this. Like this is there's definitely disturbing elements to the story. Yes? Yep. Mm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, no, that's a fair comment. And yes, it is true that we do not see any reference to Sarah in the story. And one possibility, and a very reasonable one that you've just put out there, is that he did tell her and she went along with it because that was the nature of the relationship and she trusted. Some scholars sort of have a contrary view and suggest that the reference to going out early in the morning might indicate that I don't think maybe this is the one time we don't need to sort of debrief ahead of time. I'll just head on out. So those are both possibilities. But yes, the fact that Sarah's not mentioned is striking, and she is still alive at this point. I'll go on to verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So what we see here is that Abraham is ready to go through with this. We, of course, have the benefit of, we read the story, we know how it ends. Abraham doesn't know how this is going to end. Abraham is clearly in a difficult spot here. But he builds the altar, he lays the wood on it. It tells us how he went through all the methodical steps, and that Isaac, as we could tell, did not offer any resistance, and he lays him on top of the wood. And notice the directness of the statement, where it says that Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. This is, Abraham was going to go through with it. You don't write this way and put it this way if he was kind of like, okay, I'll just kind of make the motion here and I'm just waiting. Like, he's ready to do this. He's offered sacrifices before. And while I don't agree with Greg Boyd's interpretation of whether this is God's command or not, one thing that Boyd does point out that is correct is that human sacrifice was common in the ancient Near East. And so it's not as horrific to Abraham in his culture as it is in our culture today. And so while I do believe that God did give Abraham this command, I think Boyd is correct that Abraham likely had internalized, assumptions of the prevailing culture. And so for him, this command wouldn't have been as crazy as it seems to us now. So I think Boyd is correct on that point. It's still not something Abraham would have wanted to do. This is his son, Isaac, after all, his son of promise. Now we see in verse 11, the angel of the Lord intervenes. Now in a previous class, we've talked before about this phrase, angel of the Lord, because the angel of the Lord has appeared to Abraham before. We see this phrase elsewhere. There is a difference of opinion among scholars on who the angel of the Lord is. There is many who will argue that the angel of the Lord refers to like a literal angel, someone like Michael the archangel or something of that sort. Others, and here I'd be more in this camp, particularly with this passage, where it's a phrase for God himself, that it's sort of God, often when God appears in incarnate form, and he's described as the angel of the Lord, because notice how it's referenced here about now I know you fear God, it seems to me to be God speaking directly to Abraham. Now, whichever one of those is correct, we still are left with an interesting quandary. Verse 11 again. Now I know that you fear the Lord. Okay, so even if we accept that God did give this command and that God is testing Abraham, it raises the obvious question. Why go through this if God already knows what's going to happen? Now, here again, you get some differences of opinion among Christian scholars. Christian scholars who fall into the open theist camp, and that would include Greg Boyd, Clark Pinnock, a bunch of others, they argue that God only knows things that can logically be known, and therefore God doesn't know the result of future free choices. And so they actually interpret the narrative passages quite literally, that God actually didn't know for sure that Abraham was going to do this, but he did, and he passed the test, and God now knows. I don't hold that view. I think open theism runs into major problems, as I've said before. And so I think it's more a case of God is speaking in anthropomorphic language, where this phrase, now I know, it's like you could think of it in the sense of when you look at it from our perspective, God knows. Abraham has passed the test. Now I know. It's sort of like, as a parent, you know your kid has done something wrong, you know it, and you get them to confess to it, but you already knew in advance, and then they confess, and you say, see, now I know you did it. But we already knew they did it even before they confessed. So I interpret it more in that context. So God knew that Abraham would pass the test, but why have Abraham go through all of this? There's a lot of things like this in the Bible that I think the answer might be simpler than what we assume. Because often we look at these, we always got to find what the meaning in the story is. Like, why would Abraham have to go through this if God already knew the answer? Why did Job have to go through his suffering if God already knew everything and knew that he was going to be faithful? And, one answer is that maybe it's for our benefit, because now we're reading about it. And now we sort of see an example of what it looks like when your faith is real, when it's genuine. And so Abraham went through this so that way we know the importance of being consistent in terms of our faith. Sometimes the answer doesn't have to be that complicated. That's kind of how I look at it. Now, we do see that God provides a ram in place of Isaac. And a lot of commentators note the substitutionary principle of sacrifice is indicated here, that this ram is offered in place of Isaac, substitutionary atonement. And here I do, when we talk about the significance of Jesus' death on the cross, I do think that penal substitution is a key aspect of what the atonement of the cross means. There's other ways of looking at it, but I think that one is an important component, and this fits well with that whole substitutionary concept. Now, back to the question that was asked earlier about when Abraham said, we will return. Why would he be saying, we will return, if he's expecting to go through with sacrificing Isaac? Here we actually have an answer. Sometimes the Bible does actually give it to us in plain language. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 to 19, in the famous Heroes of Faith chapter, we actually get the answer to the question. So for once, I don't have to speculate. I can just tell you what was in Abraham's head. Chapter 11 in Hebrews, starting in verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So we got our answer. So sometimes the answer is really easy. And so why did Abraham say that we will return? Because he had so much faith and trust in God, where he's like, well, Isaac is my son. This is where my offspring is going. He's my offspring. God has promised these things to me. I'm going to be killing Isaac, so therefore God is going to raise him from the dead, and we're going to go back together. That's how he was able to. That was how he was able to. How his reasoning in terms of him going through with it. So there's our answer to the question about what was going on in Abraham's head. It's nice when we get that. We get that so clearly, and so of course Abraham got more than he could ask or imagine. He didn't even have to kill Isaac. It was even better than killing him and then getting him back later, where God, the angel of the Lord speaks to him and says, actually, you don't have to do it at all. We've gone far enough. You passed the test. We'll make sure this gets written in the book of Genesis later, and then Christians throughout the centuries will be able to read this and have their faith strengthened. And here's a ram in place, which symbolizes substitutionary atonement, and back they go. That would have probably been a much more pleasant conversation on the way back than on the way to. And the story doesn't quite end there, because you go to verse 15, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So we see a lot of us, like when you read the story, we kind of stop at verse 14 with the ram being provided, and you miss what comes right after is a rather remarkable restatement in even more dramatic form of the covenant that God makes with Abraham. This is some serious stuff here that he's reiterating. And again, so in verse 15, the angel of the Lord says, by myself I have sworn. And again, this is why I think the angel of the Lord is God himself. Look at how it's being phrased here. By myself I have sworn this. And the fact that God swears by himself gives to these words a unique authority. It's assuring Abraham that these words are going to be fulfilled. And the oath that God takes, it falls into two parts. The first half, and you see it here, because I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. That's a lot of descendants, by the way, just in case you're wondering. That's a term, he doesn't give a precise number, because the point is to say it's going to be lots. It's going to be millions. And so the first half focuses on Abraham's many descendants. But notice how it shifts a little bit in the next part, where it now talks about a singular offspring. And so a single descendant who will overcome his enemies. Notice here where I will surely bless you and multiply your offspring and all that. And your offspring, second half, verse 17, shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And here I think you're seeing a transition from referring to the offspring in the plural to now a single descendant who will overcome his enemies and mediate blessings to all the nations of the earth. So although the second half of the oath is often taken to refer to all of Abraham's descendants, Genesis as a whole is interested in tracing a single unique line of offspring that will eventually bring forth a special king who will rule over the Gentiles. And that explains, by the way, why did it have to be Isaac specifically? Why not Ishmael? Why not someone else? Well, because from the perspective of the whole Bible, the oath to Abraham, and it traces through Isaac, and it continues with that line, comes to fulfillment in Jesus Christ. I'm going to go briefly to Acts chapter 3, verses 25 and 26, and notice how it is explained here by Peter. This is after they've healed the lame beggar. And verse 25 and 26 in Acts chapter 3. You are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. God, having raised up his servant, sent him to you first to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness. Jesus, who's been raised from the dead, he's the offspring. And this is where the blessing to all the families of the earth is going to be. And so this is where I would argue that the promises that are made to Abraham, there are multiple promises. You have promises of a nation, of a people. You have land promises that are given, and there's no indication that they're revoked. There's my Zionist leaning. But you also have a reference to multiple times to the Messiah, the offspring, and so there's eternal significance here. So you've got a nation, you've got land, you've got Jesus himself, and all of this is through Abraham, and then Isaac, and then later in Genesis we'll see how it continues through Jacob, and then through Judah, and it continues down the line there. I'll go to verse 20, a little bit here, and then I'll open up to some comments and questions. Now after these things, it was told to Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlap, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Reumah, bore Tiba, Gaam, Tahash, and Makkah. I hadn't even noticed that before. Uz and Buz. That's kind of cool. Anyway, so why is this inserted in here? It's like a little mini genealogy. And forget the chapter headings, because actually, and a lot of the commentaries will do this, they say that you should cut the chapter off at verse 19, because verse 20 actually better fits the next part that follows in chapter 23. And these genealogies, they often kind of demarcate, kind of indicate major sections of material in Genesis. And so in this mini genealogy here, you're dividing the main part of the Abraham story from several episodes later, as we'll see, that kind of are an appendix in Abraham's life. And if you're wondering, what's the reference to Rebekah? Well, that's going to be answered next week. So the author here is setting things up, giving us some context, telling us about some of Abraham's relatives in the land that he had left. And by the way, we've talked about this before, but I'll say it again. I do not believe that the author here is intending to write fiction. Why would you include all these names? Like, what is the point of all these genealogies and all these names if this is just a nice little fictitious story that's just meant to make us feel good? The author here, going through the records that would have been available to him at the time, and again, I would argue the author is Moses, is clearly careful in terms of making sure each name's correct and identifying as such. Okay, before I go on to the next chapter, I'll pause there and open it up to any comments and questions. Yes?
Yeah, I think another important thing here, Michael, is you referenced, I think, in verse 8 that God himself will provide a lamb for himself.
Mm-hmm.
And then we slip over to verse 14, and Abram called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. So we know that Moriah is Jerusalem.
Yep.
And we can look forward 2,000 years from this place where God himself provided the lamb and provided Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice. And so that's kind of another messianic theme here.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, the messianic themes are so deep. There's so many of them. And it's why it's important when you know your Old Testament and you know your New Testament, you see how they fit together, and you certainly see that here. Other comments or questions? Okay, well, I'll go on to the next chapter here. Starting in verse 1 in chapter 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. And he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. Okay, so Sarah has died at the age of 127. So again, lifespans are still longer at this point, although they are getting shorter. And what's notable here is that Abraham goes to the Hittites, so the people in the land, and he needs a burial place. Because when you bury someone, again, in the culture at the time, you'd bury them in a cave, and it's a sense of permanence. You know, just like today, cemeteries, they don't really move around a whole lot. Like once a place is designated a cemetery, it's unlikely that you're going to do a bunch of development there. So like in Simek, for example, it's unlikely that we're ever going to try to change the zoning so that way, yeah, you know what, this cemetery, it's time to put a development there. Cemeteries indicate permanence. It's just how it is. And notice how he emphasizes his status as a sojourner. Even now, late in his life, Abraham goes, I'm a sojourner and a foreigner among you. That fits, by the way, with what we read in Hebrews chapter 11, where throughout his life, Abraham is a sojourner. It just shows, again, how much faith he had that he leaves a land where he had a permanent status, and he goes to wander around in a land that he never really, truly can call his own. So what does he want to do? He wants to acquire a permanent property, at least one spot that's his, so he can bury his dead. Seems like a straightforward enough request. Now, in our culture today, you're familiar with the idea that, that you offer and then someone responds, and you sort of do the whole kind of, not fake, but you're kind of trying to both show just how generous you are. Magnify that times 10 in the ancient Near East. Frankly, even the current Middle East. There's a strong emphasis on honor and shame, and excessive politeness might be one way to put it. And as we read the next part here, keep this in mind. Both sides are speaking as though they're giving something to the other side. So just keep that in mind, that it's almost, I don't know if one of us say it's a competition, but it kind of is, where each side in this conversation is trying to outgive the other, not primarily because they're genuine, always trying to be nice, but it's a whole part of the whole honor thing. And that if you're the one who's given rather than more than the other, you've received more honor. So, because otherwise this narrative seems kind of weird. But when you sort of put it in that sense, it makes it becomes a whole lot more understandable. So let's take a look at how this little negotiation happens. Going to verse 10. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of his city, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will, hear me. I give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver? What is that between me and you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. Okay, so we've got our standard, our exaggerated politeness here. Now notice Ephron is saying, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, I give you the cave. It's unlikely that he actually wanted to give it away for free. but in your Middle Eastern kind of negotiation, you have to look like you're willing to give it away for free. And remember Abraham and Lot? And when Abraham says to Lot, we can't both be here, we've both got too much stuff, so you pick the land you want, I'll go to the other one. The correct answer on Lot's part should have been, no, Abraham, you choose. You're the senior of the two of us. Lot gave the wrong answer when he's like, sounds good to me, I'll take over by Sodom over there. I'm pretty sure Abraham in that was like, what just happened here? This was not supposed to happen. So here what's happening, Ephron is saying, sure, I'll give you the land for free. Abraham is like, no, I will give you the price of the field. And it's not just a case of, I think there's a significant element here of Abraham doesn't want to be in debt to the Hittites. He doesn't want, because you know how it is when someone gives you something for free, you kind of like, well, is it really mine? Am I just borrowing it? Like, am I here temporarily? And so Abraham is like, no, I will pay the actual price. And then Ephron responds, and notice how he phrases it here. My Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between me and you and me? Bury your dead. Now, you skim through that, it kind of looks like Ephron is just frustrated and like, it's just a piece of land just worth this. Like, bury your dead. Look how much I'm helping you out here. Okay, but hold on a second here. 400 shekels of silver. Now, how much is that? Well, they didn't have coins at the time. And so shekel is a measure of weight. A shekel was 11 grams or 2/5 of an ounce. 400 shekels is about 10 pounds. It's a massive amount. Almost certainly this is hugely overpriced. Abraham is paying way more than the price. Ephron here, and again, a lot of the commentators make the same point. They say that he's kind of ripping Abraham off. Like they're doing their exaggerated politeness back and forth, and Abraham is, in a sense, being suckered in terms of paying this excessive amount. But Abraham, of course, he's wealthy, and he can afford to pay it, and so he does. And he measures out 10 pounds of silver. That's a lot of silver. Abraham is one wealthy guy, the fact that he's even able to pay this. But yeah, no, it's maybe the strategy could be used in some of our car dealerships and all that. Some extra sales strategy here. And offer the car for free, and then like, no, I'll pay for it. A car worth $150,000? What is that between me and you? Like, just here's the keys. So who knows? Maybe you could do that. Then we go on to verse 17. So the field of Ephron and Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah east of Mamre, that is Hebron in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. And what's significant here is that now we have the first time Abraham actually owns some property. Late in his life, after Sarah has died, he actually owns some land in the land of Canaan, in the promised land. And it's a burial place. So you can see how when the author of Hebrews is telling us that Abraham, he's a sojourner in this land, he really is. It's only late in his life that he owns any property in terms of land. He owns other property, his cattle and all that, but as far as actual land, it's at this point that he actually has this permanent piece of land here. I'll open it up to comments and questions in just a moment. A couple things that would stand out to me in terms of when applying this and thinking about this. First of all, we know that God tests us today. This is something that happens. It's good to remember that when being tested by God, we don't have the full perspective. Abraham certainly didn't at the time. He actually was pretty good with his reasoning. That's not bad thinking, though, that, okay, God told me to do this. He said, we're going to have many descendants, so maybe he'll raise him from the dead. Abraham didn't have the full perspective, but he still had faith in God. And this is similar for us today. I doubt we're going to be called to do this. Bad application of this is to be sort of thinking, hey, God might ask me to sacrifice one of my kids. Wrong application. If you're getting that out of the story, stay away from young people. But rather, it's a reminder to us that when we're in a situation and when our faith is being put to the test, we don't have the full perspective. And even if you sort of think about Pastor Walter's sermon earlier today, when he talked about forgiveness and how forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean that you're reconciling with that other person, because that other person may not be willing to reconcile with you. But it is possible that, that things happen in such a way that it changes the course of your life and God uses it to bring about some good. And maybe in the context of that, your faith is being tested and you have no idea at the time in terms of what this could possibly be used for, and only with the benefit of hindsight, many years later, do you start to have that perspective. So it's just good to remember that. Second point here is that, again, remembering that the faith of Abraham, it's a good example to us today. His faith is not perfect. We've seen that. Like in these two chapters, Abraham looks pretty good. Like this is like some impressive faith here. Like he follows through with God's command on Isaac, doesn't have to do it in the end. He has ultimate trust, faith in God. He finally buys this land in the land of Canaan. This looks pretty good, but we've, of course, been reading the rest of the book where Abraham has been having doubts and questions, and where he ends up marrying his wife's servant, and where he ends up lying to protect his own skin about who Sarah really is, his connection. So his faith is not perfect, but it's still a good example to us today. Like this is what an imperfect faith can look like, because it is still genuine. And so, again, a good reminder to us. Okay, we've got a few minutes left here, and so I will open it up to any comments and questions. Sam, go ahead.
It is curious to me that the first piece of land that Abraham purchases that he's going to install it in becomes the city of refuge in the future.
Yep. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting things that sort of connect later on. And but yes, that is an interesting connection there. Yes, Ruth.
Were all sacrifices in that day living sacrifices? So he puts Isaac on the altar and then raises his hand to kill him. Was that a pattern? And did he do the same thing with the ram? And did these animals not fight a little bit?
Yeah, I first of all, in terms of the sacrifice of animals and such, were they living sacrifices? All indications are that they were, because otherwise, as it says in Leviticus, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin. And if it's dead already, it's not a sacrifice anymore. As far as how do they get some of the animals on the altar, well, these are shepherds, herdsmen, and all that. They have experience with having animals go where they don't want to go. So you round them up, you hold them down, and you do what you got to do. And they had their techniques, like with the knife and all that, in terms of how they'd slash the throat. They could do it pretty quick. But yeah, now I will qualify this by saying that I forget the exact passage here, that there are other sacrifices that were available for people that were super poor in ancient Israel, where they could offer up, where they could bring, I believe there were some times where they could bring like a grain offering and that sort of thing. I'd have to look that up more specifically. But certainly when you've got living creatures, yeah, I don't know of any sacrifice where it's dead, where they never would have a situation where you've got a ram that died of old age. Oh, perfect, we'll sacrifice this. It's always got to be like the best and all that, and while it's still alive. Otherwise, not really a sacrifice. Right. Yeah, and then you put it on, then you light the fire, and off you go. Yeah. So, yeah, no, they could do that and then put it on. But that's part of the whole sacrifice process. So it's not, again, even in the word sacrifice, you're giving something up. You're giving something up of value, of great value. And it's not a sacrifice if it has no value. So again, one of your sheep that died of old age or got sick and all that, you're offering it up as a sacrifice. You're not sacrificing anything. You're just like, well, I got to get rid of the body anyhow, so I might as well just burn it here. There's no sacrifice. It's a sacrifice if it's living and it has value. So that would be why I'm pretty sure that they were always alive at the point where they're being, just before they're being sacrificed. Interesting. I've actually never been asked that one before. That's an interesting question. Other comments or questions? Okay, so I'll wrap up here because we're just a couple minutes before 12. Reminder that next week we'll be in Genesis 24, and I'm pretty sure it'll be just one chapter because I'm just looking at the length there, and it's the Genesis 24 is actually longer than 22 and 23 put together. So that's the story of Isaac and Rebekah. So that is what we're going to be focusing on next week. So I'll close with prayer, and then we're dismissed. Heavenly Father, Lord, I just thank you again that we can study your word. And Lord, I thank you that we can learn so much from Abraham and his faith. And Lord, it wasn't a faith that was perfect, but it was a faith where he did trust in you, and when it counted, he passed the test. And I just ask that you would strengthen us in our faith and help us to remember that the importance of seeking to follow you at all times. I ask this in Jesus' name, amen.